read a story about a man who was in conflict with his 15-year-old daughter. He knew she was using birth control. Several nights she had not bothered to come home at all. As parents, he and his wife had tried various forms of punishment, but nothing seemed to make much of a difference. Their daughter lied to them, deceived them, always found a way to turn the tables on them, blaming her behavior on them for being so strict. The man said that he remembered standing in front of the window in his living room one night, staring out into the darkness and waiting for his daughter to come home. And he said he felt such rage. He was so angry with his daughter for the way she manipulated him and his wife and constantly tried to find ways to hurt them. He was obviously also upset because he knew she was hurting herself more than anyone. In that moment, he understood more than ever before those passages in the Bible where God expressed frustration, passages talking about how the people knew how to wound God and how God would cry out in pain. As angry as he was, he said, when my daughter came home that night, or rather the next morning, I wanted nothing in the world so much as to take her in my arms, to love her, to tell her I wanted the best for her. I was a helpless, lovesick father. Do you believe that about God? Is that how you picture him, as a lovesick father? Because it really is the most biblical image you can have. A God who was standing in front of the window, gazing achingly into the darkness, waiting for his child, you, to come home. Countless numbers of people who have opened up their heart to God's presence and comfort in the midst of their pain have found this to be true. After being a prisoner in Ravensbrück, one of the infamous concentration camps in Nazi Germany, a woman named Corrie ten Boom traveled throughout the world telling her story of suffering in the context of a faith in God. For 33 years following her time in Ravensbrück, she never had a permanent home. And when she was 85 years old, some friends provided her with a lovely home in California, and it was a luxury she never dreamed she would have had. One day, as a friend was leaving her home after a visit, he said, "Corrie, hasn't God been good to give you this beautiful place?" And she replied, "God was good when I was in Ravensbrück, too." One of the more difficult tasks I was ever called upon to perform was as a pastor of a church outside of Louisville, Kentucky during my seminary years. A friend and member of the church called and told me that his next-door neighbor had just committed suicide. She was a mother of 5 girls, and her youngest daughter had found her. They had no church, no pastor. He asked them if it would be all right if he called someone from his church to come. And they said yes, so he called me. And when I arrived, I saw huddled in a corner of the house the 5 daughters with their father. And I thought, what am I doing here? What could I possibly say? What could I ever do that would help at this moment? I went over to the family, I introduced myself and said the only words I could think of, "I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I am so very, very sorry." And the girl who had found her mother looked up at me and said, "Would you pray for us?" So I prayed. I don't remember a single word of that prayer. But when I finished, that little girl looked up at me and simply said, "God's here, isn't he?" And I said, "Yes, he is. Yes, he is." And she said, "I thought so. I could feel him hugging me when you prayed. It's going to be all right, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, honey, it's going to be hard, but it's going to be all right." But being with us is not all that God has done. He's invested himself in the process of healing the wounds that come from our choices by entering into the suffering process with us in order to lift us out of it. The heart of the Christian faith is that God himself in human form came to earth in the person of Jesus and suffered. He knows about pain. He knows about rejection. He knows about hunger and injustice and cruelty because he has experienced suffering. We worship, as German theologian Jürgen Moltmann observed, the crucified God. Jesus on the cross was God entering into the reality of human suffering, experiencing it just like we do, to demonstrate that even though we used our free will to reject him, his love never ended. This was not suffering for its own sake, but rather suffering so that we might use our free will to choose again, this time making the right choice. Frederick Buechner put it this way. He said, like a father saying about his sick child, "I'd do anything to make you well," God finally calls his own bluff and does it. The ultimate deliverance, the most significant healing, the most strategic rescue has come. Our greatest and most terrible affliction has been addressed. God has given us the greatest answer to our questions. He has given us himself. And he's going to keep giving himself to any and all who will turn to him until the end of time. And time will come to an end. A missionary was once asked what Jesus will say when he returns to the earth, because Jesus himself said that he would return at the end of all things. And he thought it was an odd question, but then he remembered the verse in the Bible he was referring to about Jesus' return is from the first letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the people of the church in Thessalonica. And it said, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a commanding shout." And the person wanted to know, what's Jesus going to shout? The missionary thought a moment, and then it came to him. He said, "I think he's going to shout, enough. Enough suffering, enough starvation, enough terror, enough death, enough indignity, enough lives trapped in hopelessness, enough sickness and disease. At the end, when he returns, Christ will shout, enough." That is the story you need to know. And this raises the real question when it comes to our broken world. Will pain and suffering drive you away from God, or will it drive you to God? The whole reason it is being allowed and that enough has not been shouted yet is because God is hoping for people like you to turn to him. Because remember, he really is that love sick Father.